Right. And so if you had to pinpoint a time in your career, would you say there was a specific moment where you feel like you'd figured out the majority of the principles that you describe in your book, Disciplined Entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it was interesting because the first time, my first company, I had no idea. I was very confident, and very high confidence levels is not a great thing when you're an entrepreneur. You should be humble. You should be hardworking, and so that one didn't do well. The second one, I really worked very, very hard at it, and that's where I really learned it. But I didn't really know that I'd learned it. By the third go round, that was when things really started to make sense. And the third company was Visage went from 50 million market cap when I arrived to $500 million 2.5 years later. And that's after I sat down and said, wow, I've really learned something. And and I didn't know exactly what I'd learned, but when I started teaching at MIT, I codified it, and that ended up becoming the book, Disciplined Entrepreneurship. And those things are not from, those are not things that I just invented. Those were things that I picked up from many different places. And from great books like Crossing the Chasm, Blue Ocean Strategy, sales techniques I'd learned at IBM, things like what's now called design thinking. All these concepts had kind of been out there, and I've been assembling them into kind of a toolbox. So it wasn't until I kind of went back and thought about it that I realized, wow, this was much more systematic than I thought. And I say, but that's n equals 3. That's only 3 times. But when I started to teach it, I saw people having success. Then I realized, wow, these things work. And then at that point, it was really refining it more and more and more. So clearly, you think you know it when you're successful, but you don't know as much as you do because you've only had 3 iterations. So it's really been after I've seen hundreds of companies that I realized these principles work.
That's an interesting process. So I'm wondering, were you kind of teaching, even if it wasn't completely fleshed out, was the stuff you were teaching really in line with the 24 steps, and then you saw your students learning these steps and applying them, or did they organically come across the same steps that you discovered and you saw it work that way?
I did not start with the 24 steps. I started, this is something you should know. And then I had a reader from another book and a reader from another book. And then I had this other thing here. And then when I finally sat down after developing this reader and iterating on it over a number of years at MIT, I realized, look, I got to simplify this thing down to something that's reasonable. And 24 is a lot of steps. People often say, can't you just do it in 3 or 4? And you can't just do it. It's more complicated. But if I had 50 steps, 100 steps, that'd be too many. And so somehow I felt 24 was the right number. And to your point, that just evolved over time. That was probably 3 or 4 years before, or more actually. I'd say it's more like 5 years that it evolved to say, here's 24 key steps. Now I should also say, Angeli, that is not everything that you need to be an entrepreneur. It's how do you go from an idea or a technology to really a product. There's a whole bunch of other things you need to do to flesh it out. So the Disciplined Entrepreneurship book is really 24 steps to get good product market fit. But I had a vision at the beginning, there'd be Disciplined Entrepreneurship product market fit, Disciplined Entrepreneurship finance, Disciplined Entrepreneur, and I didn't plan to write them all either, just to be clear.